Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Constitution Center. We are so excited today to take you on a virtual tour. What are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about voting and elections. That is the theme of the week, the month, the year. It is election season, so we figured what better way than to celebrate by taking us on a virtual tour of the center's exhibit spaces. My name is Madison. I'm going to be with you for part of the tour today. Also today is my wonderful colleague, Kevin. Kevin, do you want to say hello to everyone joining us?
My fellow Americans, good evening. I'm speaking to you from the White House. Just kidding, not quite. But we are here in the main exhibit at the National Constitution Center. And we're excited to talk to you about all things voting and elections as we get closer to Election Day. We'll take a look at some election technology, some past presidential elections, and maybe some things about the Constitution and amendments to show how voting rights have changed over time. So I'm here and excited to go. Madison, let me know whenever you're ready and we can get started.
Absolutely. Folks, we encourage questions. We're going to have questions for you. Kevin's got a lot of trivia that he would like to shout out throughout the tour. So get ready to type your answers into the chat. But speaking of the chat, that is going to be your best way to communicate with Kevin and myself. We're going to make sure that we keep an eye on it so that we can answer those questions that you have and get to as many of them as we can. We hope to wrap around in about half an hour, 30, 35 minutes. And then we promise that we're going to stick around for questions at the end. I know that Kevin is famous for his trivia questions, so we might even have some more kind of like a bonus round at the end, which will be a lot of fun. But without further ado, I'm going to let Kevin take it away to talk about really what the Constitution says about voting, voting right amendments, and then of course what early elections looked like over 200 plus years ago. So Kevin, you can start there and then we'll see where you take us.
All right, thank you, Madison, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us for a tour of the center's exhibits focusing on elections and also voting rights. As we'll see, many of the amendments to the Constitution have had to deal with this question of voting and who was able to vote. We're going to trace that history as we make our way through. Let's begin with sort of a few fun trivia questions just to get us started. And we'd love to hear from you. One of the most recent amendments to the Constitution, although passed several decades ago, has to do with the age of voting. So if anyone would like to put in the chat, how old do you have to be to participate in elections and vote for, let's say, President of the United States or your local representatives? How old do you have to be to vote for president? We are seeing his responses in the chat, and that is 18. That is correct, 18 years old for voting. And voting has been central to the amendment process over time, and we're going to introduce a few of those amendments in a moment, and Madison will get into a few more of them in detail. So voting has changed over time, certainly. Who has been able to vote, and also the process for voting. Some of you may have noticed the small green box behind Madison in her introductory screen, but we have a few other objects sort of right here. So let's see if I can zoom in on some of these to see how voting has changed over time. If you were to go back to, let's say, 1700s or 1800s, you might see something like this. Looks sort of like a trash can, but this might have been how you would have voted. We have a lock up here on the top, of course, to make sure the votes are secure, but you would go to your local polling place and put your ballot folded into a receptacle such as this for people to count the ballots later. Then as we fast forward, maybe over to, let's say, the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s, you might vote with more of a lever like this. So you come up and you cast your ballot for whichever candidate you want. And this brings us to our next trivia question. If anyone happens to know, what are the two major political parties that we tend to vote for during elections? And then bonus points for anyone who can name some other parties from the past that may have been central to the election process. So we're looking for the two major political parties today, and also some more or less well-known political parties from America's past. As we get further on in history, we might have seen something like this. Those who remember the famous sort of butterfly ballot, where you'd have your folded booth here, or your folded card, and you'd be able to punch the ballot. But in more recent times, of course, we are more familiar with something like this. You go to your polling place and you're able to enter a voting booth and cast your vote for the candidate of your choice. And here we have sort of a wonderful interactive in the center's main exhibit, where you're able to enter a voting booth and vote for past president, sort of a mock election. You might get John Kennedy against Ronald Reagan. You might get Dwight Eisenhower against Barack Obama. Some of the most famous presidents from the different political parties who you are then able to vote for. And we see some here in the chat, people who have said, yes, the Democrats and the Republicans are our two major political parties today. But other parties that we'll touch on in this tour today, the Federalists, the Whigs, the Anti-Federalists, certainly. So the parties have evolved over time, and voting has evolved over time, both in terms of who was able to vote and the technology that we've used to actually cast our ballots on voting day. But what has remained constant in American history is that voting is important. It was something that was very important to the founders and something that remains important to this day, being involved, learning about the candidates, and casting your ballot. So let's go through in our main exhibit, which those of you who have been in here before, it's a broad timeline of American history, ranging from colonial America all the way up to the present day. I'll sort of step out here, give you kind of a wide angle lens. As we make our way through the exhibit, it is the timeline. You will see content pieces and artifacts relating to whatever time period you're at, interactive features such as the voting booths, but of course we tie it all to the Constitution. So up in the blue glass panels, we have the entire text of the Constitution, the preamble, articles, and subsequent amendments. Now, if anyone happens to know how many amendments we have added over time to our Constitution, feel free to put that in the chat. You know, the original Constitution wasn't all that long. It was only about 4 pages, but we have added to the Constitution since. And we see Kevin is the first to say so. 27 amendments have been added to the Constitution. Very good. And of those, many of them have been important when it comes to voting. And the amendments were subject to sort of the voting process. So does anyone happen to know maybe what was an amendment that changed the right to vote? Or who was granted the right to vote, perhaps based on an amendment? How have amendments changed the Constitution over time? Because there are quite a few that we're going to be touching on today. And if we sort of spin around over here, we have, someone says the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. Very good. Take a look at this wall over here. This just shows a few of the amendments over time that have changed the voting process. So these two specifically play a major role in changing the voting landscape, who actually is able to participate in the political process. And we're going to ping it back to Madison to get into more detail about both the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, as Bonnie mentioned. Over here, we have some other amendments, which we'll also touch on. The 23rd Amendment, which grants electoral votes to those living in Washington, D.C. We're going to get into what electoral votes mean in a minute and where that comes from. The 24th Amendment changes poll taxes and eliminates the concept of using poll taxes. How many of you would want to have to pay in order to cast your ballot? And then also we have over here the 26th Amendment, which, as you all mentioned, changes and lowers the voting age to 18. That's where it stands today. So now we've got sort of a grasp of this idea of voting and how voting has changed through the amendment process over time. Let's go back and go through the exhibit and take a look at some of the history and take a look at some important presidential elections over time. So now, as we move through, and this may or may not be an easy one, who is the only president who was ever unanimously elected? He gets every single vote possible. Everybody voted for him. Who was that? And that, of course, is our first president, as someone says, George Washington. Of course, everybody likes George. And Washington, as we see here taking the oath of office, was different from presidents in a number of different ways. Of course, he gets 100% of the vote, and I can't imagine that that's something that's likely going to happen in our own time today. Maybe, but not likely. Washington gets 100% of the vote, and he gets that twice. He also never formally joins a political party. So someone had mentioned the Federalists before. Those are the two main parties right now, the Federalists, and then they were known at the time as Republicans, but confusingly today, we refer to them as the Democratic Republicans. So he never really formally joins a political party. And he also resigns after serving 2 terms. And we'll get to that in a moment when it comes to how many terms a president can serve. Washington established a tradition. But after Washington leaves, now we begin to have our first truly partisan presidential elections. And this opens up some initial real big problems about the way that we elect the president. So now, does anyone know what is the system that we use for electing presidents? Every 4 years, we have a presidential election. And does anyone know what is the system? What is the institution that we use to elect the president? It sounds kind of like a school almost. And it looks like Bonnie was the first to say, yes, the Electoral College. Very good. That is the institution that we use to elect presidents. We'll get into the specifics of that a little bit later, but we still use that today. Although it has changed a little bit. Which brings us now to this election between two rather famous founders. They weren't actually present for the signing of the Constitution, but they were main authors of the Declaration of Independence. So if anyone happens to recognize either of these two, feel free to put that into the chat. And while you're identifying these two, would you be surprised if I told you that the early version of the Electoral College was slightly different? Everyone who was voting for president, their name went on the ballot, and whoever got the most votes, or I should say of the candidates who were running, they all went on the ballot. Every elector had 2 votes. Whoever got the most votes became president. Second most votes became the vice president, regardless of what political party you were from. So imagine that, think back to the candidates in our most recent presidential elections. Every election, the top Republican and the top Democrat then having to work together as president and vice president. You can imagine those weekly lunches at the White House might be a little uncomfortable, but that's what happened back in the election of 1796. John Adams, as we have in the chat, very good, was a member of the Federalist Party. And over here we have Thomas Jefferson, and he was a member of the, we'll say, Jeffersonian Democratic Republican. Adams ends up defeating Jefferson by 3 votes. But according to the rules, Jefferson, even though he didn't agree with Adams on much of anything, becomes his vice president. They have a rematch again 4 years later, and this time Jefferson wins, giving Adams the dubious distinction of being the only president ever defeated for re-election by his own vice president. But the election of 1800 was also really complicated because, yes, Jefferson beat Adams, but he actually ended up in a tie with his presumed vice presidential running mate. And if anyone happens to know that, is the dear, dear friend of Alexander Hamilton, who was that other Republican that Jefferson ended up tied with, who then later refused to surrender to Jefferson, and it threw the results of the election into a frenzy. No one really knew exactly who was going to be president. And that is, of course, Aaron Burr. Yes, the same Aaron Burr who fought the duel with Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton actually ended up trying to get people to vote for Jefferson rather than Burr. There was a saying that Hamilton knew he could trust Burr to make mistakes, or he could trust Jefferson to make mistakes, but he could not trust Burr at all. So after this chaotic election of 1800, they amend the Electoral College to the way that we know it today, establishing different tickets for president and vice president, and also different ballots for different political parties, acknowledging the 2-party system. So we have early and very fractious elections in the early 1800s, but not everyone is actually able to participate. So as we're moving on through, and we're still in the early 1800s here, what do you think were some of the requirements to vote in elections at the time? Yes, we have to be 18 years old now, but there were some more requirements back in the early years. What were some of the requirements, do you think? What types of people were expected to be involved in the political process? Or we could phrase the question another way, which people were not allowed to vote in early presidential elections, or any elections for that matter? Right, we have one saying that one of the requirements is owning property. Yes, that is absolutely correct. Property ownership was one of the requirements early on. Right? You also had to be someone who paid your taxes. Right? You also necessarily had to have a certain amount of wealth. But the requirement, of course, was that for the most part in states, voting was limited to white, wealthy, landowning men. One state, New Jersey, allowed women to vote, some women in the early years, but then that right is taken away. As we move into the early 1800s, though, and we get into this period here, the age of Jackson, it becomes a bit easier to vote if you are a white man. They drop a lot of the property requirements and the wealth requirements, but there's still big groups of people who aren't able to vote. African Americans, in many cases, both free and enslaved, and of course, half of the population, which half of the population still does not yet have the right to vote and wouldn't have the right to vote until further along in our timeline. Women, yes, absolutely. The women, yes, do not have the vote. All right, so we're going to say as we move forward, it will take some constitutional amendments to fix that. Now, as we're moving forward over here, and by the way, one of the elections of President Andrew Jackson ran in 1824. Jackson ends up winning both the popular vote and the electoral vote, but no one actually wins that election. There's 4 candidates who run, and it becomes sort of a mess. Does anyone know what happens? And to this day, if someone doesn't win a majority of electoral votes, if no candidate wins a majority, who decides? Who's the tiebreaker? let's say we have 3 candidates running and they all get votes, what part of government decides who would be the president? And the building behind me is not at all any kind of hint. It is, in fact, the House of Representatives. Very good. So here behind me, we have our models of the 3 different branches of government. We have, and if anyone happens to know what are those 3 different branches, feel free to put that in the chat. We've got the Capitol building over here. We've got the court building over here. And then, of course, back in the corner over here, the smallest of the 3, we have the White House, which you'll be able to see right there. So we have our 3 different branches. They are to scale. They are relatively exact size. They're like 1/100th or so, perhaps, of the size. And voting is central to many of these different branches. So let's see if we can do some more trivia and figure out what are the jobs of these branches and how the people who are in these buildings get their job. All right, so let's begin with the Supreme Court. Does anyone know how one becomes a justice of the Supreme Court, or how many justices we have on the court? Anyone happens to know that? Or we'll move over here to the presidency. If anyone happens to know how many terms a president can serve, and then what are the 2 different branches of the legislative branch? If anyone happens to know any of those, feel free to put those in, because there's different ways that you get to have each of these jobs. For one thing, to be a member of Congress here, you have to be at least 25 years old to be in the House, at least 30 to be in the Senate. And then one of the requirements to be president is you have to be at least 35 years of age. And the president can serve 2 terms. There's been one specific example where that hasn't been the case. We'll get to that in a moment. And then the justices are appointed by the president. Very good. So there's different requirements for all 3 of these different buildings. But specifically, the one that we focus on, and mentioned earlier, is the Electoral College. And does anyone know, on election day, how many votes does a candidate need to win a presidential election? Any idea? Or the requirements, someone had mentioned the requirements to serve as president. You have to be at least 35. You have to have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. And you have to be a natural born citizen. And someone says 270 votes to become president of the United States. Yes, very good. So 270 votes in the Electoral College. If no candidate gets the 270, then the election is thrown to the House of Representatives. So it is a complicated process, but it's one that's been in the Constitution and one that has worked. Now, let's look at the constitutional amendment and again, how we've sort of changed the nature of who is able to vote. After the Civil War, we have 3 constitutional amendments that really impact, again, the scope of the country. Some scholars have referred to this as the nation's second founding. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, right, the main cause of the war. But then there is some question as to what exactly is the status of these 4 million persons who were formerly enslaved. Are they citizens? Do they have equal protections under the law? So the 14th Amendment clarifies exactly who is a citizen and what rights citizens have. It's one of the longest amendments in the Constitution, but it doesn't really address the question of voting. And this is brought up around the time of the 14th Amendment in the 1860s. Does the right of citizenship equate with the right to vote? And during this period, we get another amendment that does begin to address that. So let me now ping it back over to Madison, who is in our feature exhibit on Civil War and Reconstruction. Madison, can you talk a little bit about the conversation of voting and how this is reflected in the amendment process?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. I am live here in our Civil War and Reconstruction exhibit. As Kevin mentioned, we have our big Reconstruction amendments. 13th, abolishing slavery. 14th Amendment, expanding those privileges or immunities, equal protection, birthright, citizenship, all of that good stuff. But it really is necessary that we pass the 15th Amendment. Now, the language of the 15th Amendment is pretty simple, right? It bans discrimination in voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which means that during Reconstruction, this is the first time really in the nation's history that we have hundreds of thousands of African Americans voting for the first time. I want to show you probably the coolest artifact we have in this exhibit. It's one of my favorites here. This little green box here was actually a container for Jamaican ginger, right? It was used to transport Jamaican ginger, and it was transformed in 1867 into a ballot box. This would have been, and let me give you a closer look, this would have been one of the first ballots that African-American men would have cast their ballots into. So let's take a closer look at it here. It's from Virginia. It's from 1867. And I want you to notice the very top of the ballot box here. If you can see it, if I go up like this, you'll notice that it says the word colored on the top. This is the nation's really first experiment with an interracial democracy. So you have African-American men who are voting at this time in a variety of levels around the nation. You have local elections, national elections too, and you see the power of the ballot box really come through during this time period of Reconstruction. You have 500,000 African-American men voting during this time period in 1868. I mean, this is huge, right? That's 500,000 people who can now vote that were previously not able to. So voting becomes a major part of these Reconstruction amendments, of course, and it expands access to the ballot box. You know, people who had previously been disenfranchised can now vote. And this is a really kind of pivotal moment in the nation's history. But it's not the only kind of transformational moment. We also have, in addition to voting rights expanding, you also have Black office holders coming into power for the first time. This is our office holder section over here. And you have kind of these, I'll kind of highlight these four men that are right over here. But now you have, which is amazing, you have now formerly enslaved individuals, African Americans, who are now able to run for office and who are winning these elections. Our first Black senator, Hiram Rhodes Revels, this guy right over here, is the first one to become a first African-American man to be elected to the Senate. It's a really big deal. It's this kind of big shift in power here, this idea that we can be an interracial democracy, interracial office holders, and all of that good stuff kind of comes together by way of the 15th Amendment. Here's a trivia question for you though. Since Hiram Rhodes Revels was elected, this gentleman right over here, since Hiram Rhodes Revels was elected in 1870, it's a long time ago, he was elected in 1870, venture a guess, my friends, how many African-American senators have we had since Hiram Rhodes Revels? The number might surprise you. But while you're thinking that over, consider the stories of Hiram Rhodes Revels, Blanche Bruce, Robert Smalls, these folks who decided to kind of flip the script here, and they themselves are now able to run for office, they can vote. This is a time period where you see just access to the ballot and democracy just expanding. It's huge. Now, consider the question I asked, how many African-American senators have we had since Hiram Rhodes Revels? Might surprise you, only 11. 11 between 1870 and 2022, only 11. So that's crazy. One of the things to consider, though, too, is that while this is such an important time period in our nation's history, and we're making such progress, you have more people who can now vote, more people who are now running for office, there are also some major barriers that are still in place to the ballot, some major discrimination that takes place in the Jim Crow South. And for that, I'm going to ping it back to Kevin, who can talk more about these policies that attempted to disenfranchise African Americans.
All right, Madison, thank you. So we're back here in the main exhibit, and yes, we have our 3 Reconstruction amendments. And with the 15th Amendment, this idea, the promise of expanding the right to vote. And as Madison pointed out, there is a period during Reconstruction where this attempt at a multiracial democracy works, but it's not without opposition. Through various ways of poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, people are continuing to be denied in practice the right to vote in some states. So it continues to be a question of who exactly is able to exercise the right to vote during this time. The 15th Amendment, which language states that the right to vote cannot be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, while significant, and Frederick Douglass has a quote where he says, he views it as something of amazement. It does, in fact, also drive a wedge between these two primary groups we've been talking about fighting for the right to vote, African Americans and women. And they had long collaborated. Frederick Douglass was perhaps the most famous signature on the Declaration of Sentiments back in 1848. But the 15th Amendment, while granting the right to vote to African Americans, is interpreted by the court not to interpret the right to vote, or not to extend the right to vote to women. And it does drive a wedge between these groups. And infamously or ominously, Susan B. Anthony, one of the most famous leaders of the women's suffrage movement, remarks in 1870 that if women do not have the right to vote now, then it's going to be another 50 years before that is the case. And it fractures the leadership of the women's suffrage movement over whether or not to support the 15th Amendment. Some, like Lucy Stone, her husband Henry Brown Blackwell, they do support the 15th Amendment and feel that, while women's time has not yet come, that yes, it is moving, that we are expanding the right to vote. People like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, however, they do not necessarily support the amendment and begin working immediately towards passage of another amendment that would, of course, extend the right to vote. There is one other amendment, though, during this time, before we get to 1920, and I'm going to ping it back to Madison for that, and it's the 17th Amendment. And that changes how we elect senators. We might be accustomed to, and of course, we're going to be doing it again soon, where the people directly elect their senators. But that wasn't always the case. While we always elected members of the House of Representatives directly, for a long time, the senators were chosen by the state legislatures. And this was something during this progressive era that it was seen as perhaps something that was going to be changed. And eventually, the amendment process, which requires 2/3 of both the House and the Senate, and then 3/4 of the states, do end up finally agreeing on the 17th Amendment, which would change how we vote for senators. But now we come up to 1920. And fun fact, if anyone has to know, what day is Inauguration Day? Today. And then what day was the old Inauguration Day? The day that the new president, might be you someday, is sworn in. What day is Inauguration Day? There have been two of them in our history. And the one today, of course, is January 20th. But that wasn't always the case. Very good, Laurie. Yes. Our previous Inauguration Day was on March 4th. And that date in 1913 would become central to the fight for women's suffrage. So I don't know if Madison is with us again, if she's back here in the 19th Amendment exhibit. Yes, she is, in fact. So I'm going to turn it back over to Madison. Madison, we were just talking about Inauguration Day. So I'll turn it back to you to tell us what happened in 1913.
Thanks, Kevin. Yes, prior to the 1930s, we used to inaugurate presidents on March 4th. But of course, today we do it January 20th. But I do want to say, in regards to the 19th Amendment, in regards to women's suffrage here, the suffragists took a wild approach to securing the vote. They decided to take it to the streets. As you can see behind me, we have the streets of our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., March 3rd, 1913, the day before which president's inauguration? Feel free to throw that into the chat. Who is going to become president on March 4th, 1913, is about to be inaugurated. And the suffragists are saying, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take this opportunity in Washington, D.C. to show that the incoming administration of President Woodrow Wilson, that the demand for women's right to vote is not going anywhere. So what do? They organize a parade. They have these floats here. You can see that they've organized this big procession in Washington, D.C. to demand support for the cause. You have folks who are going to be wearing their suffrage white. They're donning their sashes. They're riding in cars. It's so much fun, this idea that we're going to take it to the streets and demand the right to vote. It's very different than the tactics that were used, say, in the previous generation, maybe from your Stantons and your Anthonys. These women are instead going to take their case. They're going to grab their sashes and their banners, and they're going to make sure that that this is the time that the nation must hear us go, that we are going to continue to advocate for the vote by whatever means necessary. And as Kevin mentioned, this idea of voting rights kind of expanding during this time period, the same energy is brought around the women's suffrage movement, the same kind of logic, if you will, that is used during the Reconstruction Amendments. You see, the 15th Amendment bans discrimination on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And the 19th Amendment, identical language, except it just bans discrimination based on sex. There is some opposition there, as Kevin mentioned. Susan B. Anthony predicted it would take another 50 years. But I do want to highlight a really cool artifact that we have in our exhibit space here, which is a ballot box that women used and tried to use when they were attempting to vote during this time period of Reconstruction. Now, here's the ballot box, but I'm going to kind of give you an up close look here because I want you to notice something about the ballot box. Here it is. It's from, we think, around the 1870s to the 1890s. Women would have cast their ballots into it. They would have taken the little paper ballots, placed them into the top of the ballot box here. But notice what it says right here. It says women's ballots. So this would have been a ballot box only allowed to be used by women. Now, women don't, until 1920, is it protected that they have the right to vote, but there are parts of the country who are allowing women to vote in perhaps local elections. It depended on where you were. You know, it's this idea that states obviously still set the rules and the laws for voting. So it really depended if you were a woman, where you were living and where you could vote. One of the important things and kind of the coolest pictures that we have in the exhibit here, this is my favorite. It's called The Awakening, and it shows this geographic split in the suffrage movement. Shout out to all of our West Coast friends who are joining us, because this image here really showcases that women in the West had more access to the ballot. Here's our next trivia question, friends. Which state is the first to fully enfranchise women, gives them the right to vote? Which state is it? Sometimes it surprises people. It's not California, it's actually Wyoming. Wyoming is the first state. Well, when it's a territory in 1869, it's the first territory to enfranchise women. And then when it becomes a state in 1890, it's the first state to fully enfranchise women. So what does that mean? Well, you got a rush, a flood of women coming from the East Coast. They're coming out west. They're coming to Wyoming, California, Arizona, Colorado, all of these states that are giving women the right to vote. And that's where they're going to shift their energy to. When women finally win the vote in 1920, after a multi-generation long battle for the ballot, it's a huge victory in 1920. Women are celebrating, you know, this long, hard victory that we've been fighting for. But I think it's important to note that the story does not end there. There are still major barriers to the ballot from 1920 onward that Kevin can address when he's walking throughout the main exhibit. One of them, of course, will be these ideas that we still see kind of permeated throughout the Jim Crow South, like poll taxes and literacy tests, that will not be addressed until finally we get to 1965. And Kevin, I believe you are in 1965 now, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you for a little conversation about the Voting Rights Act.
All right, Madison, thank you. So yes, we're nearing the end of our main exhibit here, and we've reached the point in the 1960s where, despite nearly 200 years after our story began, there are still people that are fighting for equal rights and fighting particularly for the right to vote. What's interesting about the amendments that we've been touching on is that, you know, yes, there is such a promise of voting rights, but the language makes it such that it doesn't exactly extend the right to vote totally to anyone. The 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment's text do not say that certain people have the right to vote. What it says is the government cannot deny the right to vote based on race, color, previous condition of servitude, or sex. So there are still ways through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, that people are denied the right to vote. But in the 1960s, we see another sort of burst of constitutional and legislative activity that would further expand the right to vote. Of course, we have the civil rights movement, famously, if anyone happens to know, of course, this famous figure behind me and what famous speech he is giving, you can feel free to put that in the chat. But the year after this speech, this is 1963, 1964, we have the Civil Rights Act, and the following year, the Voting Rights Act from 1965. And this would go largely to fulfilling some of the promises of the 15th and the 19th Amendment. That same time in the 1964, I believe, we have the 24th Amendment, which would finally abolish the practice of poll taxes, charging those who might not be able to afford it for casting their ballot. And then by the time we get to the early part of the next decade with the Vietnam War, and many people feeling that those serving should also be able to vote, we do have the passage of the 26th Amendment, which extends the right to vote to anyone under the age of 18, lowering that standard of voting age. So with the 26th Amendment, and then later with the 27th Amendment, which is actually the result of a class project, that actually goes to just show that all of us are part of this constitutional conversation. All of us are involved. And from the beginning up until now, that's what we encourage. learning about the Constitution, studying about the Constitution, and understanding how the government works and your role in it. So sort of to that end, we want to thank you all for joining us today, and knowing that we're all a part of this constitutional conversation. And one of the most important ways that you can be involved is to exercise your right to vote. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining us. Madison, thank you as always. And we'll stick around for a few moments. If anyone has any questions about anything that we've covered, any questions that you had going into this tour about voting or elections, please feel free to ask. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin. That was amazing. What a fun tour. We really got our steps and moving throughout the exhibit spaces. But folks, I want to thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you next time. And we thank you so much for joining us for this fabulous way to commemorate and celebrate election season. So thank you so much for tuning in.